right, TGIF, it's Friday. Dustin Heisler here, along with Joe Morris. We're back for another episode of In Case You Missed It. Another busy week in the world of GovTech, but this week we've got a guest, and we're really excited to bring on Cyd Harrell, author of a Civic Technologist Practice Guide. Joe and I have been thick in the reading of this book over the last couple of weeks. And Cyd is a civic innovator that's held notable posts across the Center for Civic Design, 18F, even Code for America. So we're really excited to have her on the show today to talk a little bit about what she has written. Cyd, thanks so much for carving some time out today to join us.
Thank you for having me.
So to start, let's dive in maybe to a little bit about yourself and your journey in this world of civic tech. How did you kind of get involved in this entire ecosystem?
I was working at a user research shop in San Francisco. And we had a project in 2009 during the last pandemic. Remember H1N1, where some friends of the Stanford called us up and said, "Hey, we are working with county health officials who need to distribute information about clinics and vaccines. We're trying to work with Google Sites templates, and we're just having a heck of a time making this easy for them and making the information work for the public." So we did this like flash, really fast pro bono project to help county officials get public health information out quickly. And I got intrigued. And I realized that we'd never had a government client in the 5 or 6 years I'd worked at that place, and started to think about why isn't government considered something that UX designers can work on? And eventually I started discovering the world of hackathons and open data, which engineers are deep into already by 2011. Started spending some of my weekends going to hackathons, wondering if I would get kicked out because I don't code, and discovering that actually I wouldn't get kicked out. People were really nice. And if I said, "Hey, I can help you, I've got some methods that might be useful," people were really willing to help. And so I started to meet some local government officials and discovered that Code for America was starting up in my area, and really got involved when I had an exchange that her fellows were doing, and said, "Can I come and mentor some of your fellows?" And she said yes. And so I started working with those classes, and a little bit the rest is history. That little research company, Bolt Peters, was bought by Facebook back in 2012, the design firm. And I decided that life, and research, got myself hired at Code for America eventually, and then did a federal term at 18F, and came back to California, where I'm now consulting on a couple of different projects, one exec branch and one judicial, which is really interesting.
That's fascinating. And during a pandemic, you had time to write.
I started before the pandemic. And I think, I got excited about this project and writing this book at a coffee conversation with a friend around the holiday season last year. And I came home and I told my husband, I wrote a book outline in a taxi. And he said, "Well, let me see it," and he liked it. And he said, "You should totally do this, but you know what, you better get it done before the November election. Because one way or another, be a rush of people into federal or state civic tech, just depending on what there's probably going to be a lot of interest around then."
So that's an interesting and great point. I think an observation. But so your book, A Civic Technologist Practice Guide, I mean, maybe you could spend a few minutes talking to us about what challenge you set out to tackle, and why should our audience pick it up this weekend and read it?
So I wanted it to be both an onboarding guide and a survival manual for people who work in public sector tech, and specifically, to some degree, private sector in public sector tech. People who are already doing that or have had a tech career back and forth, or people who are inside GovTech and want to get more connected to some of those cool private sector things. My biggest use case is somebody who does this can hand it to somebody new and say, "Check this out, and then let's have coffee when you're done."
I love that. So I know that, civic technology is not a new concept. It's been around for a long time, even back when I was in government. There was the civic technology movement, Code for America, all these different organizations. I'd love to hear kind of how you would define civic technology. How does it differ? How is it inclusive of kind of what the world is calling GovTech today?
It's really interesting. Everybody has a different definition. Mine is that we should have public goods. We should have public digital goods as good as the ones that we can get from private companies. And to some degree, that often involves more interaction between public sector tech practitioners and private sector tech practitioners. Sometimes it's seen as bringing private sector things to the public sector, but that's not always the case. But I want everybody working on tech and government to have access to the best of design practice, the best of engineering practice, and the communities that go with all of that.
One of the things that at least I grasped you in the book was you talked about the civic tech movement being in its adolescence.
Yes,
teenager in its teen years, and I know sometimes it's a little hard to pull out the crystal balls, particularly during a pandemic. But what do you think the next 3 to 5 years look like for something that's going to come into adulthood?
So I hope some reflection on some of the things that in our first 10 years we maybe haven't attended to enough, so forth. And also a bigger recognition of the role that folks already in the public sector, so career government staff and folks who work in IT, really play in the success of it. But I see an expanding role for really good public digital goods, and I think the pandemic has accelerated that too. Government agencies that I know that wouldn't consider remote meetings ordinary, that do now. And that have set up ways for the public to interact with them over all kinds of things, from SMS to websites to chat, much faster than I thought they would. So I don't see those things going away when we get back to being able to go into offices and do things at counters. So I think that there's going to be hopefully some thinking then about, okay, now how do we want the digital to play a role, and how can we preserve those spaces at counters for the things that humans are really good at and that computers aren't, so that people have those. I think it'll involve a lot of thinking about infrastructure too, because in order to really underpin this, we need to work on some of the bigger stuff, not the web interfaces and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. This is kind of a moment to reimagine what's possible, and a lot of agencies are doing that. Now, one thing that really fascinated me about your book is you profiled a number of different mechanisms that are really fostering innovation in the public sector today, from internal organizations that have been set up to do that to community groups that are like Code for America brigades and other things. What did you learn in your research about how to codify and scale innovation in the public sector that you could share with our audience?
A little bit of it taking a village. You know, you need executives who are at least tolerant, if not fully aligned. The participation and excitement of mid-level government staff who are well socially connected. So I think every agency, they're usually senior something or a manager. They've been around 10 years, 15 years, but they can also talk to the frontline staff. And where those people are excited about and supported with practice and community, they can. So I always try to meet whoever that is who knows everybody the moment I start working with a new.
It's a great point. I mean, you also, as in your book, you walk through the various decision makers that are involved in, in this process.
There's a little more to it too.
Oh yeah, go ahead. I mean, feel free.
Yeah, I was going to say, you have to figure out where you want to operate, or where the problem that you want to work on actually is handled. So you can't do a lot of volunteer work at the federal level, for example. That's something that, volunteers can really help at the municipal level and sometimes the state level. But for various regulatory and access reasons, it's just really hard to do. So federal really has to set up formal structures. And there are some things that aren't really government responsibilities. So sometimes people set up things that are much more mutual aid-like, or that have to do with citizen engagement. So you have planning or contacting legislators, or those kinds of things that I think civic tech often sees as part of its domain that work. So basically, to do a project, you need to know which government agency at what level handles it. So when I say level, I mean federal, state, county, city, never mind regional park districts and so forth. And then you need to understand whether leadership and the current administration has policy priorities that align with what you want to do. And then you need to find those internal champions, and then you need to figure out what's an appropriate way, whether it's a product mechanism or a consulting mechanism or a volunteer mechanism, to work with them. And then you need to really check who's already doing the work and trying to solve this problem, because it's almost always the case that somebody is. And I think, one thing we in the private sector tech industry are unfortunately known for, but truly known for, is jumping in on things that other people are doing. And I really advocate for finding advocates and champions who've been doing this work and just giving them some superpowers from these interesting tech skills that we happen to have.
Things right now, particularly over the last 6 months, seem they're moving a little quicker. Whether digital transformation that stresses that government are under seem to be greater. What role does or should public policy play in this conversation?
I think a significant role, because the pandemic has forced movement towards remote work, remote service, and at the same time, if that's not aligned, and make certain things. So it's actually really great if I have a nice smartphone and I have good broadband access and I have easy access to Wi-Fi, that I can get all my service remotely, and I might want to continue that, and I might think it's not very cool to pay my taxes to keep those offices open, but that's not an equitable way to think. There should be policy around what role the digital plays. There should be policy around access for everyone. And I think there's always policy around technology, even if we don't think about it that much. So there's policy around what technology gets used, and that's where we have seen a lot of movement in the last 7 months. But technology can't really move forward if it's not aligned with policy. So the example I kind of talk about in my book is cannabis policy, where if you are really excited to go and expunge records for marijuana convictions, if you're not in a legalized state, and if you're not in a county where the district attorney has a policy favoring expungement, it doesn't make a lot of sense for you to build a prototype, except maybe as a thought experiment.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know, so COVID-19 has accelerated a lot of re-looking at, modernization and kind of reimagining and rethinking about these systems, and across state and local government. I mean, all sides were kind of like,
absolutely.
it was just a really unprecedented event. So what have you seen change kind of from your purview with the government agencies that you're working with?
One of the things, this isn't a government agency I'm working with closely, but the first weekend that shelter-in-place orders started to go into effect, I saw some cities move really quickly to have information up in depth with really well-structured online content deliverable on phones and so forth. And that's a big change from even 5 years ago. City digital teams have really advanced, and you can really kind of see who has embraced some of these things, like having content strategists on staff and having QA people on staff. And so they were able to have some people work overtime over a weekend and be fully informing the public on Monday. People who didn't have those roles in place struggled a lot harder to get all that information up to do such a good job. There's a really cool story from San Francisco that they actually got to place a content strategist in the emergency operations center so that they could be getting out messages in real time. And I was just amazed that sort of their standing and practice in the city had advanced far enough to do that.
That's great. That's great to hear. I mean, I think that's the stuff that we all look for, right? Are those bright, shining examples that occur across government. For those that hopefully are going to be cracking the cover of your book this weekend, it contains a lot of valuable insight for individuals that want to work with government and work in government and work with policymakers. And we all know, I think, on this right here, that's no easy task sometimes. But what are some of the must-dos for an individual that's looking to work in civic tech?
The absolute biggest must-do is listen. Assume that policymaker colleagues know as much and have as much to teach you as you have to teach them. Assume that tech doesn't make you any smarter than anybody else. It makes you have a different and interesting set of skills that are really useful. But I have found that the people that I meet in governments who have committed to service at a career are some of the most amazing, capable humans I've ever met. And being able to have a conversation with them where I hear about what their challenges are and how they And then maybe I help talk about how user research and product management can help improve that. Those are incredibly productive conversations. So that's start learning what it's like, start learning the regulations, start meeting about the constraints. And if you're a creative techie, consider you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the most difficult questions I think to answer in this civic tech space is around sustainability. And, I think we've seen a lot of amazing innovations that have kind of come through, but they've been ripped out, they've been subject to politics, they've been overly politicized. So, what are some recommendations that you have for bringing about long-term change and sustainability in this world kind of going forward?
There are a whole bunch of mechanisms for that. And it's true, if you have loudly done something that is aligned with a current administration and that administration loses an election, your whole thing might get shut down. And that's sort of not something people coming from private sector tech are used to. But in thinking about how to navigate it, you've got to be aware of the policy and the politics. And then there are certain levers that really make a difference, like thinking about procurement. You may not know this. I think if your listeners are mostly government tech, they know all about this, but procuring something like a software as a service product to, say, recruit a panel of people to stress test your application can be really hard to do for many government services. So private sector people sometimes feel like, oh boy, how can I even work without the tools I have? But working on changing those rules and helping people assess procurements and get good service from private sector firms that they want to hire and understand, how do I write a brief for a really strong design and build agency, or how do I write a brief for a database project that's really going to get me what I want? That's a fantastic way to help. Getting involved in legacy system migrations, as hard as they are, can also be a way to help. From my own field, I really see user-centered design and user research as something that's an incredibly accessible skill that's also really powerful. When people sit with somebody who's trying to use something they made, whether it's a form on a piece of paper or a complicated application, where they're working with a company or another agency and having to transmit data and so forth, people understand the impact of technology choices in a way that allows them to talk about them better and communicate about them better. So those are just three. I think I list probably 7 or 8 in that chapter in the book, but I think that sustaining work, the last one is working together and not burning people out.
That's certainly a big deal right now. We've been doing a lot of events across the country, and it's top of mind on the government officials' mind is burnout right now in this environment.
Yeah, I think that's true of my partners too, at both the judicial and executive agencies. It's just everyone is trying to do their best, and we thought maybe this would be a 2 or 3 month sprint, and here we are.
No kidding. Well, thank you very much for taking time out of your Friday afternoon to join us this week. How can our audience connect with you and your work?
I am pretty much a Tweety bird, so find me on Twitter. My handle is my name, and I would love to talk to you about this stuff anytime.
Awesome, guys. Well, don't forget, check out her book right here. It's worth it. It's a quick read. It's extremely worth your time if you've got nothing to do on Halloween. Into November, it's worth it. It's jam packed. So we'll put the link to the book in the show notes. And again, Cyd, thank you very much for taking time out of your day and joining us. And if you've missed this episode, check out us on the website ICYMI.video. We'll have this video and others posted up there. And join us again next week, same place, same time. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.